Greetings all. Welcome to Aquarian Diary. I'm your host, John Irving. It is July 17th, 2023. Today, the North Node moves into Aries and the South Node moves into Libra for about 18 and a half months. I did a whole episode on that. I will include a link to it and many other articles and resources in the episode description. By the way, as I was working on this, I read a very interesting article at Politico, which fits into the narrative I articulated in an episode titled My Dream About North Node Transit Aries. It is eerily on that theme. Link in the description. Also, if you are interested in an astrology reading with me, I'll include a link to that as well. This episode includes a wide variety of thoughts that I have on an extremely important topic. It meanders quite a bit, so please bear with me. I think it's all relevant, and like I said, very important. This is an episode I have started to record on numerous occasions going back months. It is a topic I have been thinking about for decades. I have stated here before that, in my opinion, the human-caused global environmental emergency is the most significant crisis that humanity has ever collectively faced. Our entire civilization was built upon a rather stable climate that affects everything from our agriculture to housing to governance, law and order, trade and commerce, geopolitics, health, medicine, technology, everything. All of our assumptions about how society works will be questioned. Unfortunately, humans tend to be creatures of habit, and there are many people who are very poorly adapted to changing and shifting environments, both with respect to the biosphere and society and social conditions. However, we have clearly now entered a new epoch of great and unpredictable change. We have been vehemently warned about this for decades, and yet our carbon emissions have gone up year after year after year. We are now beginning to cross very dramatic tipping points. Our governments have done almost nothing to prepare for this, at least nothing adequate. I am not aware of a single country on the entire planet that is remotely prepared for what is coming. This is due to gross or criminal negligence or incompetence or all of the above. And it doesn't matter whether they are liberal or conservatively oriented. So the next question is, what can we as individuals do about it? How can we prepare? Those of us who are not in denial about this have an advantage. At least we are willing to see what is staring us in the face. Yet, this situation is so complex and multidimensional that it is possible that many of us have not fully considered some of the implications of this situation. As I have said, this is something I have thought a lot about, and so I will offer here a few thoughts of my own in case there are some things that I have thought about that maybe you haven't. This is intended to be extremely pragmatic, so please consider it from that perspective. First of all, do not be reliant on the grid for power. What that means is that if you need electricity to run anything from pumping water to cooling your residence, do not be 100% reliant upon it. In the event of extreme weather, the grid can go down for extended periods of time. Generally speaking, our ancestors would prepare for 1 in 100 year events. Now we have to be prepared for 1 in 1,000 year events. If running air conditioning, for example, is critical for your survival, do not be relying on the grid to run that. If you are in an area that goes through very hot periods and the grid was to go down for a week or 10 days or something like that, it could be life-threatening. Also, you can survive for weeks without food. You can only survive a few days without drinkable or potable water. If you are on a municipal water supply system, as opposed to something like a well, you will need a water supply. You can run well pumps off of things like batteries, generators, or solar power. In extreme cases, food may also be an issue. There could be situations where you cannot rely on traditional sources of food like grocery stores, especially in cases where things like floods or high wind conditions knock out the grid. So you should have a supply of essential goods that you can consume. That also includes things like medicines or prescriptions that are critical for your or your family's survival. Telecommunication systems may not be reliable. You should have a portable radio so that you can stay informed in the event that the grid goes down, which can also include things like cell phone or internet access. You will want to stay informed and possibly be entertained during prolonged outages. It could take days or weeks before telecommunication systems can be repaired. If you do have something like a gas-powered generator, you will want to make sure that you have enough fuel to run it as needed. You may not want to run a generator 24/7 for weeks straight. It may be better to run it a few hours a day to, for example, keep your freezer cold, charge your cell phones, connect to the internet, etc. Of course, things like rechargeable LED flashlights, which are much more efficient and brighter than traditional flashlights, are definitely something that you want to have on hand. And maybe an induction cooktop. They are quite inexpensive now, as well as supplies of things like bandages, disinfectants, and so on. It is probably also advisable that you have what is known as a bug-out bag prepared. This is usually something like a backpack that has a small collection of emergency supplies in the event that you have to leave very quickly. Some articles of clothing, a flashlight, some snacks, a small portable power bank for charging your phone, that kind of thing. Anyone who works in data management is familiar with the concept of storing important backups and documents off-site. This is done so that if there is something catastrophic that occurs at one location, you still have copies of all your digital files and documents at another. Many people do not think about this, but if, for example, your computer was unavailable or destroyed, would you have all of the documents, photographs, and things like that are stored on it, or would they be lost potentially forever? You can buy external hard drives very cheaply these days, and it is a good idea to back up all of your important documents, such as deeds, banking information, and those kinds of things, and store them at a safe location that is remote from you. And by remote, I mean at least hundreds of miles away. Even better, another country or continent. Don't forget things like passwords, identification, serial numbers, vehicle identification numbers, health documents, contact numbers and information, insurance policy numbers and contact information, anything that you might need in a crisis or emergency. And don't just rely on your phone. If it gets submerged for any length of time, it may be completely destroyed. If you are involved in a large-scale extreme weather event, something like a hurricane, you have to consider that first responders could be overwhelmed for days. Remember Hurricane Katrina. One of the things that I think many people fail to consider is that in a major extreme weather event, their entire region could be very dramatically affected. Even if their property comes through relatively unscathed, their whole region could be in a state of emergency, and it can take weeks or even months for the system to be stabilized. That means that they could be surrounded by thousands or even millions of people who are in a state of disarray and shock. Most people are completely unprepared for these kinds of events, and you have to consider how other people will act and respond in such circumstances. After such an event, even if you want to leave your area, it may not be possible. Roads and other forms of infrastructure may be significantly damaged, and you may be stuck in that area for quite some time. Generally, if you're in an area that is already prone to periodic extreme weather events, be they hurricanes, floods, droughts, or whatever the case may be, you can anticipate that there will inevitably be extreme weather events of that kind, except that they will be much more intense than anything most people are familiar with. Ideally, you are not located anywhere near a floodplain. If you do live on a floodplain, and it is rated for 1 in 100-year events, that is entirely inadequate. Look at what happened in Vermont recently. It has had flooding events before, but they were extremely rare. Ideally, you are not situated in low-lying areas, nor do you want to be in higher elevation but more exposed areas where you might be subject to high winds. So somewhere in between is ideal. But like I said, recognize that even if your property receives minimal amount of damage, you may be surrounded by many neighbors, or your entire community could be in a state of chaos. People who have lost their homes will need shelter and their basic needs addressed. When it comes to coastal regions that are prone to hurricanes, it's an entirely different scale. Entire states could be devastated by Category 5 level hurricanes, some of which may stall over particular territories. As the wildfire smoke that poured into the United States from Canada recently demonstrated, we can even be affected by events that are occurring hundreds or even thousands of miles away from us. Clearly, face masks are in order if you want to go outdoors in such conditions. You probably also want an air purification system to purify your indoor air. You can even make one of these using furnace filters and readily available fans. You also have to consider things like bill and debt payment systems. If the grid was down for weeks, would your credit rating be destroyed because you weren't able to make payments on time? You can set up prepayment systems in advance so that your bills, utilities, and loan payments are made automatically, even if you are not able to access your payment systems regularly or easily. Do not count on cell phone towers being functional 24/7. They may not be at all. If you live in an area that is already prone to extreme heat, you have to consider how you would survive if the grid was down for days or weeks. As far as I am concerned, this is absolutely critical. If you live in a forested region, you have to imagine what would happen under extreme conditions where, for example, the grid was down for extended periods of time. Would you need to be evacuated? Where would you go? Or if you were cut off, how would you survive? It is possible, and probably inevitable, that particular states are going to be completely screwed. Florida and Louisiana come to mind. They will be dealing with sea level rise as well as more powerful and intense hurricanes simultaneously. So basically, you need to question everything. Do not make any assumptions. Think about the worst case scenarios, and insofar as it's possible, prepare for that. States like Texas, for example, have very fragile grids. Generally, Republican or conservative areas are the least prepared for these kinds of events. There are large numbers of conservatives who do not even believe that what is happening is happening. They have a huge disadvantage because reality is going to slap them in the face. If it was me, and I could afford to, I would leave areas that are already prone to extreme, dangerous weather events. Water is critical for life and for agriculture. There are some regions that are already struggling with water demand, and those situations will continue to worsen for years and decades to come. There are certain regions that already experience extreme weather events that, as far as I'm concerned, are going to be very dodgy when it comes to habitability. This includes many equatorial regions, North Africa, Australia, the Middle East, large parts of the Mediterranean, many northern communities and regions, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, Arizona, Nevada, Central America. I personally think there will be large tracts of the globe that will literally be uninhabitable. Google wet bulb temperature. Many homes in Europe are not prepared for these kinds of events. There are many places that do not even have air conditioning, nor the grids to support millions of them running at the same time. Anywhere that is already subject or prone to periodic, highly damaging extreme weather events or flooding, insofar as it's possible, should be avoided. Obviously, places that are highly prone to extreme fires are also areas to avoid. Even if you are not directly hit by the fire itself, the smoke and the destabilization to infrastructure can be life-threatening. So you will want to stock up on food and have several weeks of food supply on hand, bare essentials at least. When we think about states like Florida, for example, it's not just that it may get hit with one massive hurricane or extreme temperature event. It's the ever spiraling and increasing cost of confronting those kinds of events, rising insurance rates if they're available at all, and so on. How will the people and the state deal with relentlessly spiraling costs and expenses to maintain its infrastructure in these kinds of situations? Those costs have to be borne by someone, and much of it will be the state residents and state businesses. You do not want to be in those kinds of places. These events will continue for decades, and that threat will always be hanging over their heads. Think of, for example, the citrus industry, the water supply systems, roads, highways, utilities. Like I said, think about the worst-case scenario, and then project it forward for years or decades. One other thing I've been meaning to mention for a long time is that the current state of affairs with respect to our global environment has been expected and anticipated for many decades. There isn't a person in power, either politically or in the military or in the corporate world, who hasn't been fully briefed on this. So it's important to recognize that people have known about what is happening now for a very long time. So there is a high degree of accountability that can be applied to those people and those institutions who have neglected to address this most critical of all issues in any kind of reasonable or responsible way. You can quite easily argue that this is one of the most profoundly and disturbingly criminally negligent failures that has occurred in all of human history. And it would be nice to see some people held accountable for this situation, although I highly doubt that that will occur to the degree it is warranted. Another thing to be aware of is that the IPCC has stated that we should anticipate that overall crop yields will decline by 10% per decade going forward. I suspect that is an understatement. So bear that in mind as well. Food availability will be diminishing while costs will be increasing. Severe weather events are already compounding the agricultural crisis, at the same time as we are having the insect apocalypse, a lack of pollinators, and highly unusual weather conditions and events which are destabilizing and undermining agricultural production. I suspect that many people at first glance think that it would be wise to move to far north latitudes. This would be a mistake. The polar region is warming at a far greater rate than more equatorial regions, and the ecosystems of the far north are very sensitive to even minute changes. Large areas of permafrost have begun to melt, which introduces all kinds of other issues and concerns that are quite significant. It also poses risks to infrastructure such as roads and buildings and ports. There is no place that will be left unaffected, but mid-latitude regions will likely see the least dramatic impacts initially. Marine ecosystems and industries that rely upon them are extremely vulnerable. We can anticipate many significant coral bleaching events and die-offs. This is virtually guaranteed. These habitats are extremely bioproductive and are at risk of disappearing. So if your livelihood or your community is reliant upon the fisheries, for example, you should be very concerned. Virtually all low-lying coastal regions or river deltas or low-lying islands in the ocean are at high risk for a wide variety of reasons. Sea level rise, marine heat waves, ocean acidification, and amplified hurricanes or typhoons pose significant threats to these regions. All of these compounding environmental crises pose a serious risk in terms of destabilizing societies, cultures, countries, and various regions, for obvious reasons. It is quite likely that if the situation worsens dramatically, in fairly short order, there will be an increasing call to limit the combustion of fossil fuels. This has very significant implications for many sectors of the economy. I personally expect that at some point we will see internal combustion engines banned except for specific uses, such as the military, fire and rescue, agriculture, aviation, policing, and so on. For similar reasons, it has implications for the economy, the stock market, and so on. I personally cannot comprehend how the global economy will be able to survive the onslaught of environmental feedbacks while resembling anything remotely familiar to what it looks like now. The loss of land to sea level rise alone would be of such significant proportions, it's almost incomprehensible. Therefore, at some point, there will need to be a dramatic realignment of the economy and the stock market. Even very minor changes in global economic output can shift the economy into a recession. The magnitude of the impacts we are contemplating here are completely and absolutely unprecedented. So think about those kinds of things if you have significant investments. The notion of geoengineering as a band-aid stopgap measure has recently been floated from the highest levels of the White House. To me, this is very telling and marks a turning point in this whole drama. Geoengineering on such a scale as is being contemplated is an act of desperation, one of many which will follow. It has profound risks for the stability of the world. Another thing that boggles my mind is that there are many people who should have known that this was going to be a very dramatic and significant challenge for humanity, and yet only a very small subset has been vocally expressing this. I myself have had this awareness for decades, and I have been completely baffled as to why everyone has not shared that perspective. I saw this coming decades ago, as did a few others, and we had vast amounts of highly credible information to support that conclusion. The fact that this isn't the top concern for anyone is flabbergasting. Any politician, for example, who does not have this at the very highest levels of their agenda is either ignorant, corrupt, criminally negligent, ethically or morally conflicted, delusional, or simply an idiot. If any of those things are true, they should not be in a position of leadership. We are going to have to dissect and analyze this for many years to figure out how to keep such people away from the levers of power. Anyone who isn't thinking about or discussing this topic should be ignored and deeply discounted. At this point, the evidence is so stark and overwhelming that you have to be a complete fool to not recognize the gravity of the situation. The other factor is that while humans can escape to their air-conditioned residences, workplaces, or shopping environments, wildlife and other organisms cannot. Our ecosystems are dependent on a wide range of healthy biodiversity. Much of that is going to disappear. I previously did a whole episode stating that the era of mass migration had begun. Mass migration will reach levels that most people will find completely shocking, and it will put tremendous strain on all aspects of society and geopolitics in ways that are completely outside of our normal understanding. People will need to flee various regions for existential reasons. We cannot expect millions of people to just sit there and starve or bake to death. Expecting that would be completely delusional and unrealistic. I'm sure I left out many aspects I could have raised. However, my main objective was simply to help people start to think about the broader implications of this crisis that go way beyond just the periodic flooding or fires or heat waves or storms that make headlines. Remember, there is no quick fix or silver bullet for any of this. The implications and ramifications will persist for decades, if not centuries, if not millennia, even if we stop all emissions today. Don't let anyone else mislead you or lie to you about that. I'll put links in the episode description to any related content, and if you're interested in a reading with me, I'll put a link to that as well. Many sincere thanks to everyone who supports me, especially my YouTube members. Thank you very much. Take care, all the best, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.